Greetings, research students. I'm recording a lecture on Chapter 2 in the Creswell book, which is about reviewing the literature. So our objectives for today are to explain why we need to do a literature review in the first place, and maybe some strategies for organizing your literature, for finding your literature, describing the steps or the procedures you use to conduct the literature review, um, to begin talking about APA citation and a citation manager. And I'll do a little separate lecture on setting up a paper in Word and using a reference manager, and hopefully that will help you as well. And obviously, the goal of a literature review is to lead you to a problem statement that then leads you to the purpose of why you're doing your study or your project. So that's the goal. Um, so, when we think about a literature review, we want to first talk about a broad topic. I want to study teaching, or I want to study a certain type of intervention. And what happens is, as you start digging deeper in the literature, you start to refine this topic. So it's good to kind of keep a journal of how your topic changes and shifts. Sometimes you end up back where you started, and that's okay. Um, but you want to think about when you start doing a literature search, if everything has already been done, you would say, well, why do we need this study? Why is it even worth doing? So there has to be a new, unique niche or twist on your take on a topic that makes it novel, and worthy of study. And you want to look at the feasibility and the scope of the project too. You're just one individual, and so you can't do a huge study on your own. So, for our purposes, the what's more important is for you to learn the process of searching the literature, crafting a problem statement, identifying a methodology, and then carrying out that study. And so, as your mentors will say things like, yeah, that's great, but it's too big, it's too much. Usually, we end up having students scale a project back rather than making it bigger. So, just work with your mentor on how this process is going to unfold, and accept the feedback willingly, not as an affront to your personhood, but from someone who's had more experience, who is trying to help you save time and energy, basically. Okay, so when you think about the topic, kind of start with the question, what is, how do, think about the beginning of the question too, is, um what is the effectiveness of X on Y? Or does one assessment versus another work better for this population, for example? So you first want to get the lay of the land. And if I know nothing about a topic, sometimes, and I know this, people say, don't do this, I'll start with Wikipedia because it just gives me an overview, definitional stuff. I don't always trust their references, but it's a good place to start. And then lots of times I'll go to Google Scholar. because you'll get a broad overview of topics there. Then I go to the library websites and I really refine my topic there, and you can really tweak your search terms in the library portals that you really can't do as well on Google Scholar. Um, so, um, and what I'll do too is record when I search that topic, how many thousands of hits did I get? How many articles came up? Well, if there's 2 million articles, well, that topic may have already been done. Um, so you want to kind of like refine your terms over and over until your topic gets a little smaller, if you will. Um, you also want to, um, think about, will I have access to the people who I want to study? Because you don't want to waste your time on a literature review if it's totally not feasible that someone study a topic. So I had a PhD student and she was wanting to study, I think it was Black physicians and implicit bias. And this was in a PhD program in health sciences. And I said to her, "Well, do you have access to physicians?" "No." I said, "Well, I could probably get you access to OTs. So would you be willing to switch the topic to OTs?" And when we started getting into the literature, we found that there was not much literature on implicit bias, sense of belonging, and well-being in Black OT professionals. So, um, through the dialogue with her advisor, there was a lot of literature in medicine and nursing, which is fine, but she didn't have access to medicine and nursing personnel, but she would have access to OT personnel through me. So it just was kind of a no brainer for her to help narrow and shape her topic. So the goal of the literature review is to tell us what, at the end of the literature review, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. This is the gap you're trying to identify, which would lead us to the purpose of your study. So, again, the purpose of the literature review is to synthesize, not report, one study at a time. That gets really boring. So, you want to say multiple studies have investigated this topic, and you cite Shotwell 2026, Smith 2025. You kind of cite them all together to show clusters of research, if you will. Um, and you want to relate your literature to the larger dialogue of scholarly discussion in a field or discipline, and ultimately to provide a framework for what your study is going to be about. Um, and how do you organize a literature review? Well, obviously, you should have a mentor for all your projects, but you should always start with, hey, here was my process. So explain, in order to study this topic, we uh, explored these 5 databases: CINAHL, EBSCOhost, WorldCat, blah, 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 Google Scholar, etc. Here's the search terms we used, and then the search terms and what you're finding in just a listing of literature before you even read the articles. You could probably start clustering those articles into topics. And then you say, topics in this literature review will include. All of that introduction to the literature review should be the first paragraph And that's all you need. Then you start getting into the body of the literature. I suggest outlining it. And in the outline, you might want to meet with your mentor or sort of guesstimate in the outline. That section is going to be about 1 page. That section is going to be 3 pages. So you kind of guesstimate if you're having to write a 10 to 20 page literature review for your capstone project. Well, you want to break that down into estimates of pages. It might morph, but it's really good to break it down because then it's almost like you're writing mini papers and then you weave it together at the end. Um, the key thing is to identify the central issues in a field, and you might also identify methodological gaps. Well, no one has done qualitative research in this subject matter. No one has done mixed methods. No one has done assessment validation in this topic. So, these are things you might want to think about. Okay, and here are some things in relation to a qualitative study. The big thing is that the literature in qualitative research is going to be about people's lived experience, their daily life, those kinds of things. And what you're going to see in those manuscripts is the themes that came out of it. So if you're reporting about qualitative literature, you're going to report about the themes that came out of these various studies. Whereas in quantitative studies, you're going to report maybe the data, the statistics. So and so found effectiveness for some intervention, and you'll put in parentheses P equals blah, blah, blah. That's the P value of a study to show that it was significant. So that's how you're going to use the quantitative literature for your studies. And a mixed methods study is where you're reporting on quantitative and qualitative data in that subject matter. So you should definitely have some of both. And if you're reporting about a mixed methods study, you want to report their findings. You don't have to report their methods or anything like that. And just report what they found in your literature review. Don't report, you might put Shotwell study of did a qualitative interview study with 15 OT practitioners. Her findings include 3 themes. That's it. So don't go about how I recruited people. We don't need all that level of detail in a literature review. And the same thing for mixed methods. You might just give me a sentence of what they did qualitatively, a sentence of what they did quantitatively, and then how they reported their integration of quant and qual findings. And then, so as I said earlier, you want to first identify keywords. And I do want to point out, and the librarian is really helpful to meet with the librarian one-on-one. My dissertation was about older adults. And older adults is kind of a politically correct term, but the mesh terms, that's library language, really like the term aging and aged in the literature. And so, like, that term we don't really use because it's not politically correct, right? So that's what I mean about you have to know the right terminology. So older adult might be a term, gerontology might be a term, aged adults, aging adults. You have to kind of twist it up. Elders might be a term as well. Just as a little tongue in cheek, because my dissertation related to older adults. Every time I would do like a Google Scholar search or a Google search, just plain Google search, all these weird pop ups would come up because it was thinking that I was looking for adult pornography. And so I would get all this weird stuff popping up. So terminology matters. And so it's good to put those words together in quotes, um, to really delimit. You don't want adult entertainment stuff, right? You want information about older adults and health promotion. And you put those two terms in quotations so that it takes the two terms together rather than health or promotion. That's two separate things. Put health promotion in quotes. Put older adults in quotes versus older versus adults. Do you see? When they're separate, you're going to get separate pings on your literature results. You want to design a literature matrix. Um, and basically, it's a table with articles. And I like put them on a spreadsheet because then you could sort them, you can move them around, or a word table is fine. Um, but that is really helpful for you to identify the chunks in the literature. These are the studies that talk about intervention. These are the studies that talk about assessment evaluation. These are the studies that talk about client experiences. These are the studies that talk about practitioner experiences. So hopefully that's why, to me, the literature matrix is critical. And I'll tell you, I tend to plop everything onto the matrix. And in fact, I'll download the articles, but I'll put the abstract in my table to start with too before I even read the articles. That gives me like a sort of a three, what do they call, like a 30,000-foot view of the literature versus an on the ground where I read every single article. So just it's okay to just read abstracts in the beginning because you're going to rule out articles just by the abstracts. That's not really what I'm looking for. So, kind of that's a helpful technique. And the ultimate goal of this class is to write a literature review based on this literature matrix. So, you're going to have to summarize each article. And there is a feature in Adobe Acrobat. I don't know if you have to have the premium version, but the premium versions will summarize a paper for you too. And that may be a way to help streamline your work. Okay, these are some of the databases you might use. PubMed is a big one. CINAHL's not listed here, but that's a comprehensive allied index of allied health and nursing literature. So a lot of our literature goes into CINAHL, but might not be in ProQuest or might not be in PsycInfo or might not be in PubMed. So, you might have to play around with the different databases too. Um, let's see. I think obviously you're looking for English only articles, but Google can translate articles if it looks like that article might be really valuable for you. Um, Additionally, you pretty much, and you can do interlibrary loan through the librarian, but you want full text articles for the most part, right? You don't want to, but if you can't get full text, a librarian can get a scanned copy of that through interlibrary loans. So that's important to know. Also, you could also get dissertations and capstones from other universities as well. Sometimes those are super helpful for you in writing your capstone project and your literature review. I use textbooks and websites really just for definitional terms. Like according to the CDC, health promotion is defined as blah, 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 blah. Okay. But try to avoid textbooks and websites for a review of the research because that information could be over 10 years old if it comes from a textbook. It's not as current. And in general, you want all your articles to be within the last 10 years. If your topic is pretty obscure, you might have to go the last 15 years. Um, again, look for dissertations and capstones. You may consider reports on the web, particularly government reports or annual reports of like the Pew Foundation, for example. Those might be really important. Um, and so how do you abstract the literature? Well, you look at the purpose of the study, the problem statement, what were the key results, point out the methodological flaws, and that's where you need to critique the study. But they didn't do this. Their sample was small. The measure that they used was not appropriate or whatever. So that is where you really get into the critique of the literature. Um, the literature map, as I said, is a visual summary of the literature. You could do it in a hierarchy, in a flow chart, in a mind map. You could write, on a table. I prefer a table because you could see it in one place. Um, and that will then lead to a narrative description. This is an example of a literature map. So this is the big topic, procedural justice in organization. And there's three big topics: justice perceptions, effects, and organizational change. And then all of this leads to what needs to be studied at the bottom. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And this is sort of a mind map, and use that or a table, whatever works for you, but you need some visual. We are using APA 7, and I'll do a whole separate lecture on not really APA, but on citation using APA. And you're going to have an APA assignment, so that will help you kind of either refresh or learn APA. It's better you learn it now, and I might be a little PIA about it, pain in the butt about it. Um, eh, I'd rather you do it now than write your capstone and be learning APA then. And then just, what are your definition of terms in the paper? Um, all of these terms should appear in a capstone proposal or a research plan, problem statement, purpose, research questions or objectives, literature review, the theoretical framework, and then the methods. And that is just universal in any type of research project, be it capstone, dissertation, thesis, etc. These are just the terms, qualitative studies, and I think we talked about this in chapter one, quantitative studies and mixed method studies. And so, in summary, the goal of the literature review is to clearly lead to a problem statement and the gap in the literature. And remember, you should be synthesizing these articles, talking about what they have in common, how they're different from each other, and what the clusters of topics you found in the literature, and then you identify the gap. So do not sit and report one study at a time. Number one, it'll be long, but it also shows that you're not synthesizing the literature. So hopefully you learned one new thing or more today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture. Bye bye.